Institute for Economic Justice and the Applied Development Research Solution have proposed that high-income earners pay a wealth tax to fund the basic income grant. The report has found that taxation of just 1% could generate up to 70 billion rands. Now, the Institute for Economic Justice Senior Research Consultant, Dr. Kelle Howson, joins us now for more on that. Dr. Kelle, good to have you, and thank you very much for coming on this evening.
Thanks for having me.
Can the country afford the basic income grant, or is that even still a question in whether or not the scheme would be affordable?
Yeah, absolutely. The country can afford a basic income grant, and it's no secret that the Institute for Economic Justice has been a proponent of a basic income grant, or BIG, for a long time. But this report that we've just released essentially answers that very question. Is a basic income grant fiscally sustainable? And we've shown that it is. Not only can it be afforded, but it also has positive impacts on the economy as a whole. It produces growth. It has a positive impact on unemployment. It has a positive impact on consumption, and it could reduce poverty by up to 2/3 by 2030.
So the affordability question has always come down to whether or not we are clear about the design, the model that this basic income grant is going to take. So in other words, key questions that would need to be answered: the amount that is going to be paid, right? Others are saying it is at the food poverty line in 2020, which was sitting at 585, or the lower bound poverty line in 2020 sitting at 840 rands, or at the upper bound poverty line, it was sitting at 1,268. That's one of the questions that need to be answered. The second question is, who then becomes eligible? Is it a phased-in process? Maybe you can start at a more adult end and then phase in the younger generation. And then also how it is going to be gradually phased in. Have these questions been answered?
There are different possible iterations. There are different ways that a basic income could be designed in South Africa. And what our research has showed is that the way it's designed has an influence on its impact, on its overall economic impact. So most people who are calling for a basic income in South Africa see it as building on the social relief of distress grant, the 350 rand. You know, that 350 rand has been an absolute lifeline, but it's so far below the food poverty line, it isn't even enabling people to escape hunger. So what we want to see in the first instance is that SRD grant being raised to the food poverty line so that it can at least allow people to meet their basic food intake requirements. But in the long term, we want to see the basic income grant, the value of the grant being set at least the upper bound poverty line. That means that it is enough to not be considered to be living in poverty. And that's the way that the grant would basically end poverty in South Africa. There's a constitutional requirement on the government to progressively realize social assistance within available resources. So that means there's a framework for phasing in a basic income grant that would meet people's needs and over time giving more and more people access to that grant. And our modelling shows that it's possible. Between now and 2030, we can expand the pool of people from the current pool base currently receiving the social relief of distress grant to capture all adults living in poverty in need of social assistance from the state because they are unable to enter into the job market because jobs aren't available. We have a crisis of unemployment.
So if we were to look at that, what are we looking at? About 10 million or so people currently on the SRD grant. What would be the sum then that we're looking at? Because if we were to look at 18 to 59-year-olds at the time getting 585, that particular sum would come up to 239 billion rands.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of very important things to point out when we're talking about how much will this cost. Okay, the first thing is that the net cost is lower than the gross cost. So when you say a figure like, nearing 300 billion rand, yes, that might be what the government is outlaying. But we also know from our modelling and from other research that every rand spent on that basic income grant is creating money in the economy, because people receiving the grant are spending it in their local communities. And we know that lower income people have a higher propensity to spend. They spend a greater proportion of their income, and they spend it on goods that are manufactured in South Africa. So that contributes to economic growth, and it contributes to employment. And that's what the results of our model show. So whilst it is a large outlay, that more revenue is flowing back to government in the form of VAT, and that offsets some of the costs of the basic income grant. So we believe that it is a good investment in the future of our economy. It brings more people into the economy, gives them the opportunity to contribute as taxpayers, and over time makes a difference to get us onto a new path, because the path that we're on right now is not sustainable.
So is there an admission, I suppose, in a sense, that the fiscal condition of the country now, in its current state, would not be able to fund the scheme, and therefore we would then therefore need to get additional funds from it, hence the suggestion of the 1%?
Look, it depends on how you look at it. But under our current fiscal policy, there is no space for a basic income grant. But that's because the National Treasury, for the better part of a decade, has imposed conditions of austerity and fiscal consolidation. They have a fundamental unwillingness to raise the resources that we need to support social spending and to meet people's basic needs and realize people's basic rights. So their preference is to cut spending whilst reducing taxes. We know that there was a cut in the corporate tax rate in the last budget, and that is just very difficult to justify given the level of need that we have. So we argue that there are untapped resources available in the economy which would enable us to pursue a developmental agenda and to produce growth while meeting basic needs. So that includes something like a wealth tax, but that's not the only option available. And the IEJ has put out policy briefs and papers on a number of various financing mechanisms that could contribute to funding a big. Things like a wealth tax, things like a social security tax, a resource rent tax, where if companies experience a kind of commodity windfall like we've seen in recent years, part of that profit would be taxed. We've also floated the possibility of a tax of a luxury VAT, so a VAT on luxury items, and this wouldn't, hurt the poorest households the most. But aside from raising additional taxation, there are also other resources that we can draw on. We can cut down on wasteful and irregular expenditure, and there's also been a lot of debate recently on the possibility of tapping into the Golden Foreign Exchange Contingency Reserve account, which is an account with a balance of about 500 billion rand that is owed to the government, and that could be used to fund some of this social spending. But the point is that we need to be spending money into the economy in a considered way to meet people's basic needs in order to drive growth and development. If we continue down the same path of austerity, budget cuts and fiscal consolidation, we're just choking the economy over time, and we're not going to get off the path that we're on of increasing poverty.
Yeah. So looking at some of those options, I mean, as you mentioned, it's the wealth tax. What are the households that you're going to be looking at in terms of net worth that could possibly be able to afford this 1%?
Look, I should point out that the modelling in this report was indicative, it was illustrative. So it's not necessarily the IEJ's policy recommendations that we should follow this exact model. The point of the model was to show that the basic income grant is possible with reasonably small adjustments to the tax system. And for the kind of ease of the modelling, we used a 1% wealth tax and a 3% social security tax applied differently at different times in different scenarios. But the way that the 1% wealth tax was applied in our model was that it was applied on the wealthiest quintile, the wealthiest 10%, as a proportion of their net worth, 1% of their net worth. So, just to emphasize again, that's not necessarily our recommendation for implementation, but it's a possibility for one of the ways that a basic income grant should be financed. And I should also say, we excuse me, we believe that the higher taxation of wealth in South Africa is very much justifiable given our level of income inequality, which has worsened over the last 20 years. In the year 2000, the bottom 90% of the population owned 30% of the wealth, and in 2022, that had decreased to the bottom 90% of the population owning 19% of the wealth. So with wealth inequality continuing to worsen, we do think that we need to be exploring ways to tax wealth in order to redistribute income to the poorest households in South Africa.
So what are we going to be indexing it to? I mean, are we indexing it to inflation, or is there another indicator that you would be looking at?
Indexing the value of the grant itself. Yes. So we've proposed indexing it to the national poverty lines. So Statistics South Africa every year puts out and adjusts the national poverty lines, and these are estimations of the threshold that you would need to be living below in order to be considered living in poverty. And they're based on real prices of goods in the economy. For instance, the food poverty line is based on a basket of food goods, and it tracks the amount of money you need per month to meet your daily caloric intake requirements, essentially to not be starving. And we've argued that the basic income grant should be indexed to the food poverty lines, ultimately reaching the upper bound poverty line, which is the kind of threshold below which you're living in poverty. And because those lines are independently, objectively, and scientifically determined by Statistics South Africa, they're the best indicators that we have of need. And because they're also adjusted every year, that means that the grant keeps up with inflation. It can't be eroded by inflation like we've seen with the Social Relief of Distress grant and other social grants in South Africa.
Yeah. Obviously, you would be looking at, as you put it, phasing it in and maybe including even other groups outside of the SRD grouping. Is this going to be, in your suggestion, in addition to the other social grants, or it would be in replacement of the other social grants?
So currently South Africa has a glaring gap in its social grant system, right? We have the child support grant, which does a reasonably good job of targeting children who need support. Then we have the older persons grant, which is for people aged 60 and up. But the working age adult population doesn't have access to any form of permanent social assistance aside from the SRD grant. And this is a problem because of the level of unemployment. Because of the unemployment crisis that we have, a lot of this group is living in poverty, and they are needing to, their household members who are receiving, for instance, the older persons grant or the child support grant, are needing to supplement their income through those grants. So it dilutes the ability of the other grants to be able to do their job of taking care of older persons and children. So what we are saying is we need to plug the gap. We need a basic income grant that is targeted towards people aged 18 to 59 who don't have access to any other form of social assistance. And this will help the child support grant and the older persons grant to do their job as well, and advance the right to social assistance.
Right. Dr. Kelle, I appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on with us this evening.